Hello, English 1102 friends. We are back for another session, and this time we are going to cover some parts of the gender and sexuality module. In this session, we are going to cover the play Trifles, which is the play that's on the syllabus for us this semester, and then we'll cover the short poem Lorena as well. So what I'm going to do is just work through, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to Trifles, the play, and then we'll just go through it pretty quickly, and I'll point out why it's under the gender and sexuality, how it's related. This is traditionally read as a sort of early feminist play about the concerns of women, how they are minimized by men, but also about the wife in this play, Miss Wright, pushing back against this sort of domestic violence situation that she's in. And then we'll jump into Lorena. Here you can see this is just a one-act play. It's the shortest play that is available to us in our book. It was written in the 19-teens, so it's over 100 years old now for us. It was first performed in 1916. There's a sequel to it, a story called The Jury of Her Peers. And if you look in D2L, there's a link to the text of the play. There's also a link to a performance of it if you want to watch that. If it's tough to read a play if you want to see it actually acted out. There's a link to a pretty good version of it right there. What I really want to do is go through it with you and point out the ways that it sort of shows the differences in gender, and the ways that the men sort of minimize the women's experience and women's work, and the ways at the end that the two women, Mrs. Peters and Miss Hale, make this decision to cover up the motive of the crime and to sort of side with Mrs. Wright, and why they decide to do that. You can look at the character list right here. You have the county, there's 3 men and then 2 women. You have the county attorney, Mr. Henderson, the sheriff, Mr. Peters, and then the neighbor of the Wrights, who's Mr. Hale in the play. And then there's Mrs. Peters, who's the sheriff's wife, and Mrs. Hale, who's the neighbor's wife, also a neighbor on here. You see in the very beginning, what you get in the very beginning of this play is this, in the introduction right here, this is this scene of sort of gloom and disorder. The kitchen in the now abandoned farmhouse of John Wright, a gloomy kitchen, left without having been put in order, unwashed pans under the sink, a loaf of bread outside the bread box, other signs of incompleted work. And of course you find out in the play that's because Mr. Wright has been killed and Mrs. Wright has been taken to jail in the town. And then all 5 of the characters come in. They're all bundled up. It's a cold day outside. This play is set. This play is based on an actual event that happened near Des Moines. Play is loosely based on the murder of John Hasek, which Glaspell reported on while working as a news journalist for the Des Moines Daily News. It's an actual murder of a wife murdering a husband in Iowa. And so you get this cold Iowa winter weather. And you see here, there is also this sense of fear. Let's see where it is here. There's a slight, wiry woman with a thin, nervous face. And Mrs. Hale is larger and would ordinarily be called more comfortable looking, but she is disturbed now and looks fearfully about as she enters. There is this element of fear that comes through the play, and that is typically associated with women being afraid of men and the sort of violence of men. The general organization of this play is the men look around for evidence of the crime, evidence of who murdered Mr. Hale. Evidence of who murdered Mr. Wright, and in all they're looking, they look around the barn, they look upstairs. Mr. Wright's body was found. He was strangled with a rope around his neck. They're looking for someone who might have broken in. They're looking for where the rope came from, and eventually they discover it came from the property. Meanwhile, the women actually, because they stay in the kitchen the entire time, which is traditionally associated with women's space and women's work, there's a bunch of evidence of Mrs. Wright's work in this. Her canning, and because it's gotten so cold, her cans have frozen and broken. Her quilting, and then finally they uncover her bird, which is sort of the key to understanding the motive for this murder. So you get this right here at the beginning. Everybody comes into the kitchen, and what happens is the men sort of fan out and leave and come back multiple times over the course of the play. Meanwhile, the women stay in the kitchen the whole time, because that's where the evidence is. That's where the motive for the actual murder is. And you get this description where Mr. Hale says, let's see where he's at. Mr. Hale starts to explain to you what has happened. Harry and I had started to town with a load of potatoes. We came along the road from my place, and as I got here, I said, I'm going to go see if I can get John Wright to go in with me on a party telephone. If you don't know what a party telephone is, back in the early 20th century, people shared phone lines, so you'd have 2 or 3 people all sharing a phone line together, and they'd share the bill for it. I thought maybe if I went to the house and talked about it before his wife, though, I said to Harry I didn't know is what his wife wanted made much difference. And Mr. Hale gives you this introduction to how he discovered Mr. Wright's body and Mrs. Wright in her rocking chair right here as you scroll down a little bit. I thought I heard somebody say, come in. He comes in. He finds Mrs. Wright rocking back and forth. She had her apron in her hand and was kind of pleating it. And then you get this long description right here where Mr. Hale discovers that Mr. Wright has been strangled. I ask her out of patience because he's dead. Says she dead, says I. She just nodded her head, not getting a bit excited but rocking back and forth. Where is he, says I, not knowing what to say. She just pointed upstairs like that. I got up with the idea of going up there. I walked from there to here. Why, what did he die of? He died of a rope around his neck, says she, and I went on pleating at her apron. Well, I went out and called Harry. And so they find Mr. Wright's dead body. He's been strangled with a rope around his neck. That becomes important later in the play because the motive seems to be that he strangled her bird, and so she strangled him in sort of retaliation. And then Mr. Hale goes on to tell you, well, my first thought was to get that rope off. It looked. But Harry, he went up and he said, no, he's dead. We better not touch anything. She was still sitting that same way. Has anybody been notified, I asked. No, says she, unconcerned. Who did this, Mrs. Wright? He said it businesslike, and she stopped pleading. I don't know, she says. You don't know? No. And Mrs. Wright's alibi is that she and Mr. Wright were sleeping deeply. Somebody strangled him in bed, and she never woke up. She never knew it. She says, you see right here, I didn't wake up, she said after him. I sleep sound. Harry was going to ask her more questions, but I said maybe we ought to let her tell her story first to the coroner or the sheriff. And so they've got her. You never see her in this play because they've got her in town at the jail. And the 2 women, the sheriff's wife and the neighbor, the reason they are here, their task here is to get stuff to take to her at the jail, stuff she needs, stuff she wants. That's the only reason they're there. There's also an important moment here, that first moment when the men leave the kitchen. You're convinced that there was nothing important here, nothing that would point to any motive, the county attorney says, and the sheriff says, nothing here but kitchen things. And then the county attorney says, here's a nice mess. And he starts critiquing Mrs. Wright, how her jars have frozen and all this stuff. And the reason that happened is because she's been in jail, locked up. But right from the beginning, there's nothing to see here. There's nothing valuable here. This is just women's space. They sort of discount what ultimately could have shown them the reason, the motive for the murder. But because they gloss over it as just this female space, this feminine space, that where there would never be anything important, they missed the motive. Let's see. There's also, shortly after that, you get the title of the play in the play. Well, can you beat the women? Hell for murder and worrying about her preserves. This is where her jars of what she has put away for the winter, Her jars of fruit have mostly frozen because it's so cold, so the glass is broken. I guess before we're through, she may have something more serious than preserves to worry about. Well, women are used to worrying over trifles. And the trifles, small things, unimportant things, that's what trifles means. And the women are just like the work of women and the concerns of women are just sort of discounted here as trifles, no big deal. And you get this long section right here where the county attorney criticizes Mrs. Wright's housekeeping, the dish towel is dirty, and all these kinds of things. And the county attorney says, loyal to your sex, I see, but you and Mrs. Wright were neighbors. I suppose you were friends, too. And what you get is, for the first time, one of the women, in this case her neighbor, Mrs. Hale, sort of stands up for Mrs. Wright and says, well, you don't understand women's work. You don't understand how dirty men get these towels. But it is also the first time where Mrs. Hale says, I've not seen much of her of late years. I've not been in this house, it's more than a year. I liked her well enough, but farmers' wives have their hands full. And here, for the first time, Mrs. Hale says, it never seemed a very cheerful place. And the suggestion over and over, and this is the first time you really get it in the story directly from one of the characters, is Mr. Wright was just not a very pleasant person. He was potentially even abusive. Clearly, by the time you get to the end of the story, he has strangled this Mrs. Wright's bird. The suggestion is that that's not the first time that he was violent around her, or maybe even to her. Let's see what next. There is also, right after here, you get the county attorney tells Mrs. Peters, the sheriff's wife, again, the women are here to get stuff that Mrs. Wright might need in jail, stuff that she has asked them to see about. And the county attorney says, yes, but I would like to see what you take, Mrs. Peters, and keep an eye out for anything that might be of use to us. And what might be of use to them is something that would prove Mrs. Wright's motive for the murder, the reason that she killed her husband, which is what they ultimately find in this play, and the two women decide to hide it, to keep it a secret, to keep it to themselves. Once the two men leave, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters are left to talk among themselves, which is where they really start to uncover the beginnings of what caused this. Let's see if we can scroll down to that. Here it is. Here's this section where they are talking. The men have left the room. And you get this description of how Mrs. Wright was before she got married, before she was Mrs. Wright, when she was just Minnie Foster. She used to wear pretty clothes and be lively when she was Minnie Foster, one of the town girls singing in the choir. But that was 30 years ago. This all you was to take in, and you get this description of how she was once this nice, outgoing, happy person, but years of living with Mr. Wright had just sort of worn her down and taken her happiness away from her. And then finally, right here, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Peters, yes, Mrs. Hale, do you think she did it? Oh, and then the sheriff's wife says, oh, I don't know. Well, I don't think she did. Asking for an apron and her little shawl, worrying about her fruit. And right here, her neighbor, who remembers what a happy, kind person she was, what a warm, outgoing person she was, is like, she couldn't have done this. She didn't do it. And right below that, Mrs. Peters, again, the sheriff's wife, says, here we go. Mr. Henderson said, coming out that what was needed for the case was a motive, something to show anger or sudden feeling. What everyone is really doing here is looking for some kind of motive for this murder. That's what the women are going to find, what the men are going to miss, because they think what's happening in the kitchen and the work women do is small and unimportant. And they mention that right here, that without the motive, it's hard to convict women and hard to convict somebody of this kind of domestic crime. And Miss Hale's immediate response is, well, I don't see any signs of anger around here. They're about to find them. They don't immediately see them, but they're about to find them. The first step in that finding them is they find this quilt that Miss Wright was making. She was piecing a quilt. Miss Peters says right here she brings the large sewing basket. They look at the bright pieces. And they're about to dive into the quilt and the quilting basket and look through it when the men come back in and interrupt them. Let's see. The men come back downstairs from looking upstairs in the bedroom. And immediately when the men come back into the room, they wonder if she was going to quilt it or not it. The men laugh. The women look abashed. The county attorney rubbing his hands over the stove. Frank's fire didn't do much up there, did it? And the men then immediately go back outside after they come back in for a moment to mock the women's work and to just sort of degrade what they're paying attention to. They go back outside, and Miss Hale immediately says resentfully, I don't know if there's anything so strange our taking up our time with little things while we're waiting for them to get the evidence. I don't see it's anything to laugh about. Again, the women valuing their work in a way different than the men do. Of course, they've got awful important things on their minds, Mrs. Peters says. You get the first sign of the anger, the sort of unhappiness is Mrs. Hale says, Mrs. Peters, look at this one here. This one she was working on, and look at the sewing. She's holding up the quilt, looking at the quilt that Mrs. Wright was working on. All the rest of it had been so nice and even, and look at this, it's all over the place. It looks as if she didn't know what she was about. What are you doing, Mrs. Hale? Just pulling out a stitch or two that's not sewed very good. Bad sewing always made me fidgety. I don't think we ought to touch things. And sort of without even meaning to, Mrs. Hale is covering up some evidence of the crime, some evidence that Mrs. Wright was upset, that she was angry. She started, stitching in this sort of wild way. It seems like the beginning of her losing her temper and killing her husband. I'll just finish up this end, Mrs. Hale says. And Mrs. Peters, yes, Mrs. Hale, what do you suppose she was so nervous about? I don't know if she is nervous. I sometimes sew awful queer when I'm just tired. And then right here is they find the first evidence of the bird. Why here's a bird cage. Did she have a bird, Mrs. Hale? I don't know whether she did or not. I've not been here for so long. This is also one of the things that sort of gets uncovered as this play goes along is that Mrs. Hale has not been over to see her, this woman who is her friend, but she's been sort of avoiding seeing her because her house was so uncheerful, because it was just sort of dark and not fun to be here. And by the end of the play, she sort of at least partially blames herself for not taking care of her friend, helping her friend, coming to see and visit her friend. She sort of blames herself for some of the darkness and unhappiness that clearly took over Mrs. Wright and drove her to this murder to try to escape from this trap she felt like it was in. Just like the bird, she sort of felt caged here at the end, and the only way out of the cage was killing her husband, the person who was sort of oppressing her and had taken away all her happiness, right down to killing her bird. Let's see. Mrs. Hale, yes, good. Let's get down to that. And then they have this conversation. This is more revealing. You scroll down a little bit. Not having children makes less work, but it makes a quiet house. Mr. and Mrs. Wright didn't have any children. Mrs. Peters says she didn't know Mr. Wright. I've seen him in town. They say he was a good man. Yes, good. He didn't drink and kept his word, I guess. But he was a hard man, just to pass the time of day with him, like a raw wind that gets to the bone. Again, this suggestion that Mr. Wright was not a pleasant person, and that when he was at home with his wife, he was potentially abusive and violent. They decide that they're going to take the quilt back into town, back to the jail for Mrs. Wright to work on, to give her something to do. And because of that, they start looking in the sewing basket. They look in the sewing basket. Here's some red. And it is right in this moment when they find the dead bird. They opens box, suddenly puts her hand to her nose. Why? There's something wrapped up in this piece of silk. It's the bird. But Mrs. Peters, look at it. Its neck. Look at its neck. It's all the other side too. Somebody wrung its neck. Somebody killed the bird by breaking its neck. This is the clear connection between the motive. Mr. Wright broke the bird's neck, broke her bird's neck. The last little bit of happiness, this little bird that sang and brought her happiness, and to pay him back for that, she finally snapped and broke his neck to get rid of this person, like I said, who had sort of stolen all the happiness out of her life. And it is right in the discovery of the bird and how the bird died that the men come back in. Inner Sheriff and County Attorney, Mrs. Peters rises. And the men, again, immediately, well, ladies, have you decided whether she's going to quilt it or not? The men immediately keep up with their sort of making fun of the women and the trifles, the small concerns of the women. Well, that's interesting, I'm sure. Seeing the bird cage. Has the bird flown? Let's see if we can get that. Here's, has the bird flown? It's hard for us to pick up on this because this is sort of old-timey slang, but has the bird flown? That's clearly, the bird flying would have been slang in the 1910s and 1920s for a criminal getting away, a criminal escaping. What this is very clearly an allusion to is Mrs. Wright is going to get away with this crime because the men aren't going to be able to find any evidence of motive. And her story is that somebody broke into the house and killed her husband, and without any motive, they won't be able to prove that she did it. Let's see. The two women, here we go. Mrs. Peters sits down, the two women sit there not looking at one another, but as if peering into something and at the same time holding back. When they talk now, it is in the manner of feeling their way over strange ground. The two women are feeling a little distressed, a little stressed out now because they know they have found the motive of the murder, or if they haven't realized it yet, they're getting close to finding what the men are looking for. And they're struggling with, should they tell the men? Should they show the men? And then right here, Mrs. Hale says, I wonder how it would seem never to have had any children around. No, Wright wouldn't like the bird, a thing that sang. She used to sing. He killed that too. Again, this allusion to how he had sort of taken all the joy out of her life, and killing the bird was finally the straw that broke everything for her, that broke her. We don't know who killed the bird, said Mrs. Peters. I knew John Wright, Mrs. Hale says. It was an awful thing was done in this house that night, Mrs. Hale, killing a man while he slept, slipping a rope around his neck that choked the life out of him. Mrs. Hale says his neck choked the life out of him. Her hand goes out and rests on the birdcage. And they both make the connection to this just direct connection between the motive, where she did to him what he did to the bird. We don't know who killed him. We don't know. And Mrs. Peters says the law has got to punish crime, Mrs. Hale. And Mrs. Hale's response, you can see her, she's already turning to covering up the evidence, to trying to let Mrs. Wright. She's already justifying Mrs. Wright in her mind. I wish you'd seen Minnie Foster when she wore a white dress with blue ribbons and stood up there in the choir and sang. Oh, I wish I'd come over here once in a while. That was a crime. That was a crime. Who's going to punish that? And Mrs. Peters says, oh, we mustn't take on. I might have known she needed help. I know how things can be for women. I tell you, Mrs. Peters, we live close together and we live far apart, but we all go through the same things. And Mrs. Hale is already identifying with Mrs. Wright and has decided to take her side in this and to sort of cover up the crime to help her. You get that conversation between them, and it sort of concludes with, it's a good thing the men couldn't hear us. Wouldn't they just laugh, getting all stirred up over a little thing like a dead canary? Of course, it's not a little thing. It's the motive for the crime, as if that could have anything to do with anything. And you can see Mrs. Peters right now, she is also trying to talk herself into this and talk herself into the idea that not telling the men about the bird is no big deal. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't, says Miss Hale. And then, for the last time, really, the three men come back into the play. No, Peters, it's all perfectly clear except a reason for doing it. But juries when it comes to women, if there was some definite thing, something to show, something to make a story about, a thing that would connect up with this strange way of doing it. Again, what the attorney is doing here is saying, without a motive, it'll be hard to prosecute Mrs. Wright for this crime because there's no clear motive for her killing her husband. Of course, the women already have found the motive. They know the motive, and they're not going to give it to the men. And that is, you get right there, the county attorney says, I'm going to stay here for a while by myself. You can send Frank out for me. I want to go over everything. I'm not satisfied. We can't do better. The county attorney is going to stay there and hang around and look for more evidence. But that evidence is going to be gone because Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters are going to take it back into town. You see at the end of this story, Mrs. Hale has put the bird in her coat, so they're never going to find it. And right here, the sheriff says, do you want to see what Mrs. Peters is going to take in? And the county attorney says, oh, I guess they're not very dangerous things the ladies have picked out. He moves a few things around, disturbing the quilt pieces which cover the box. They've already hidden the bird, though. No, Mrs. Peters doesn't need supervising. And so she has decided, they're both in this together. They have both decided, Mrs. Peters has decided not to talk, and Mrs. Hale has clearly decided she's going to conceal any evidence of the crime. Because they both, at least on some level, sympathize with this sort of oppression and unhappiness that drove Mrs. Wright to commit this crime. You get this long last stage direction here. Hale goes outside. The sheriff follows the county attorney into the other room. Mrs. Hale rises, hands tight together, looking intensely at Mrs. Peters, whose eyes make a slow turn. Mrs. Hale holds her, then her own eyes point the way to where the box is concealed. Suddenly, Mrs. Peters throws back quilt pieces and tries to put the box in the bag she is wearing. It's too big. She opens the box, starts to take the bird out, can't touch it, goes to pieces. Sound of a knob turning in the other room. The men are coming back in. Mrs. Hale snatches the box, puts it in the pocket of her big coat. So they both work together right here at the very end. They both together make sure that nobody can find the evidence of this crime, that nobody can find the bird, what would be the obvious motive, the obvious connection between the bird with the wrung neck, Mr. Wright with the wrung neck. Well, Henry, at least we found out she was not going to quilt it. She was going to, what is it you call it, ladies? We call it knot it, Mr. Henderson. And the last line of the play is very clearly this allusion to they've decided to tie the knot on this to seal off the evidence and not show it. So there will never be, the men are never going to find the motive they need to prosecute Mrs. Wright. And what you get in this play is this suggestion that women understand what other women go through, especially back in the early 20th century. This is before women could, this play came out, 5 years before women could vote, and that these women understand the sort of oppression and unhappiness, especially if you lived out in some isolated area on a farm, that other women go through, and they sympathize with it, and they decide to cover up the crime. There is, the reason that I put this play in this video with the poem Lorena is as much as Trifles very clearly feels like it belongs to the early 20th century and the ways that women were treated back then. This Lorena is about a historical event from the early 90s. This incident involving John and Lorena Bobbitt. If you're not, and this is before many of y'all were born, so if you're not familiar with it, it's one of those news stories that was a huge national headline, a big national scandal. Everybody talked about it for a few months. There was a TV movie made about it, and then everybody sort of forgot about it. So if you're not familiar with it, it's all right. John Wayne Bobbitt and Lorena Bobbitt were an American couple married on June 18th, 1989. Their relationship made worldwide headlines in 1993 when, after years of being allegedly raped, beaten, and sodomized by her husband, Lorena Bobbitt cut off his penis with a knife while he was asleep in bed. The penis was subsequently surgically reattached, and John Wayne Bobbitt was acquitted on the rape charge. The reason that this poem very clearly goes with this story, with this play, is because they are both stories of women just snapping, and they've had enough of their husband's sort of abusive behavior. And in the case of Mrs. Wright in Trifles, she kills her husband. In the case of Lorena Bobbitt in this real life incident, she cuts her husband's penis off. And so you get this poem. It's a short little poem by Lucille Clifton, Lorena. It lay in my palm, soft and trembled. The specific details of Lorena Bobbitt: she cut her husband's penis off. She got in the car and fled from the house after she had done this. And after she had driven a few miles, she threw his penis out the window. So that's what you're getting in this poem. It lay in my palm, soft and trembled as a new bird, and I thought about authority and how it always insisted on itself. This is where you really get this sort of oppression and unhappiness and men controlling women in various ways. Authority and how it always insisted on itself, how it was master of the man. Again, this sort of common social stereotype about how men are driven by their sexual desire or sexual violence or something like that. How it measured him, never was ignored or denied. How it promised there would be sweetness if it was obeyed. Again, this sort of, as long as you do what I say and let me control you, there won't be any trouble kind of imagery. Just like the saints do, like the angels. And I opened the window and held out my uncupped hand. I swear to God, I thought it could fly. Just this short little poem. And what this poem is about this moment when Lorena Bobbitt has snapped and fought back. And this sort of, she answers this violence that she has dealt with for years with her own act of violence, and responds and finally breaks and is like, I can't deal with this anymore. Just like Mrs. Wright did in Trifles. And so you have both of these give you these depictions of these women who have been pushed and pushed and pushed and sort of in these oppressive relationships, both of them in oppressive marriages, and they finally just snap and push back in different ways, but push back against the thing in a very particular way to show what has been bothering them or oppressing them or making them unhappy. Both of them acts of pretty intense violence, obviously. If you have questions about Trifles, the play, or about this poem, be in touch with me over email or whatever's most convenient to you. We will have another another gender and sexuality. We'll have another gender and sexuality video dealing with some of the poems that are on the syllabus. But until then, we're done for this session, and I will see y'all next time. Thanks for your time.